We've talked a little bit about the payment process under construction contracts. Now, you'll recall that the common law position was that the contractor was obligated to do 100% of the work before getting any payment from the owner. The contractor's performance was a condition to the owner's obligation to pay. And that's been varied by contract, certainly for large projects where the contractor's incurring expenses over an extended period of time, so that most construction contracts for larger projects are going to have some sort of progress payments. But in addition, that general rule has also been varied by statute in a number of places, and these are what's known as prompt payment statutes, and that's what we're going to focus on here. Now, it's useful to contrast the prompt payment statutes as they tend to be in the United States with Canada, for example. In the United States, each state, or at least most states, have prompt payment statutes of some sort. They vary from state to state, and as you can see, there's a survey of prompt payment statutes out there that's very helpful as a starting point. Generally speaking, they only apply to public construction projects, that is, construction projects funded by the state or some political subdivision of it. That's not always true. Sometimes the prompt payment statute in a given state will apply to private construction as well, and so it's good to check that before entering into a contract with terms that might potentially conflict with the prompt payment statute. Michigan's prompt payment statute is fairly typical. It applies to construction contracts, which is a defined term, entered into by, quote, public agencies, which is also a defined term, and I'm not going to go into all of the definitions, but just understand that the Michigan statute does not apply to private construction contracts, just various ones, not all of the contracts that you might think of as being let by public agencies, only some of them. That's why you have to look at the definition and figure out exactly which ones. But where it applies, the Prompt Payment Act requires the owner to make payment to the contractor within these two time frames. 30 days after the architect's certified that the work in place is covered by the payment app, or 15 days after the agencies receive funds to make the progress payment. And this has case law that's grown up around it. It's important to read the whole statute to understand the scope, but the main point here is just that this is a classic example of a prompt payment statute that requires the owner to make payments within certain time frames after the work's done, in essence. Now, that doesn't mean that the owner can't still withhold retainage. And retainage is essentially a percentage of the value of each progress payments, the work covered by each progress payment, that the owner holds in order to ensure that the contractor completes the work, and to ensure that the owner has funds available in the event that the contractor leaves deficient work in place and the owner has to have it corrected, things like that. Retainage is essentially if the contractor submits a pay application for $1,000 and the owner is entitled to withhold 10%, the contractor gets paid for $900 and the owner retains $100 as essentially security until, usually until substantial completion, at which point the owner is usually required to release some significant portion of the retainage to the contractor. But retainage in the U.S. is money that the owner holds back in order to secure itself against deficiencies in the contractor's performance. Well, the prompt payment statute doesn't affect the owner's ability to do that, at least in Michigan, right? The retainage is still an option. There's a max of 10% of the work in place up to 50%. Again, this varies from state to state, so you have to know exactly what the prompt payment statute in your jurisdiction says. But retainage is still an option, even though the owner is obligated to make payment of money otherwise due and owing to the contractor promptly. Now in Ontario, things are different. The Construction Act is what is the relevant piece of legislation here, and it governs both public and private construction projects. And unlike the Michigan statute, the Ontario statute addresses not simply payments from the owner to the general contractor, but payments from the general contractor to subcontractors and from subcontractors on down to subcontractors. So prompt payment in the Ontario context is really up and down the contractual chain. The concept is the same in the sense that the purpose in both Michigan and Ontario is to keep the construction funds flowing so that the contractor does not have to be in the position of essentially financing the construction itself while the owner sits on a pile of money. But the Ontario statute's much broader than the Michigan one, and much broader than what you would find in most states in the United States, because it covers both public and private construction, and it addresses prompt payment up and down the contractual chain, not simply from the owner to the contractor. Now in Ontario, under the Construction Act, the trigger is the issuance of a, quote, proper invoice. And I'm not going to go through all the elements of a proper invoice. You can see they're specified in the statute, which I've quoted in this slide. But the concept is that's when the clock starts running. When the contractor issues a proper invoice, that is, it's got the invoice has the information that's required. It's essentially a payment request, monthly payment application in AIA terms, and that's what starts the ball rolling for prompt payment in Ontario. That's when the owner's obligation to make payment the clock starts running on that. Okay, the clock is a 28-day clock. Basically, the owner has to pay the amount that's payable under a quote proper invoice within 28 days. Now, as you'll see, that's subject to notice of non-payment. Okay, a notice of non-payment, which we'll look at in a second, is essentially that, where the owner says, hey, some of this work's defective, or for whatever reason, the contractor's not entitled to 100% of what the contractor's claiming in its pay app, something less than that. The owner can, if it's got grounds to, withhold some portion of the amount claimed under the proper invoice, but the owner has to give a notice of non-payment that specifies the reasons why the owner is withholding payment. So subsection 2 here is the one that was referred to in the previous slide, and basically says the owner has 14 days after receiving the proper invoice to provide the contractor with a notice of non-payment. And this can be non-payment in whole, or more usually in part, where the owner is withholding a certain amount or not paying some fraction of the proper invoice for whatever contractual grounds the owner has. Now, it's important to distinguish a concept that you find in Canada that's not really a thing in the United States, and that's the idea of holdback. Holdback in Canada is essentially a requirement that the owner, for example, hold back a certain percentage of the contract price until all of the subcontractors and suppliers have been paid. I'm paraphrasing, but that's the concept. Holdback is essentially a pot of money that the owner holds back from payment to the general contractor, not for the owner's own benefit, the way retainage works in the United States, but rather for the benefit of the subcontractors and suppliers. That's the concept in this quotation here. Each payer, that means the owner, or in turn the general contractor who's paying subcontractors and on down the chain, but each one who's making payment has to hold back 10% of the price of the services or materials until essentially all the liens that could have been claimed have expired or been satisfied or discharged or otherwise provided for. So the concept of holdback in Canada is that it's money that the owner, for example, holds back from the contractor to make sure that there's a pot of money there to satisfy people down the contractual chain, subcontractors and suppliers. Okay, it's not for the owner's own benefit the way retainage is. Retainage, as I mentioned before, is designed to protect the owner against deficiencies in the general contractor's work. Holdback, on the other hand, is designed to make sure that the subcontractors and suppliers ultimately have some money there that they can claim against. So the two concepts are very different. Holdback is statutorily required under the Construction Act, and the question becomes, well, when can the owner safely release holdback without becoming personally liable for any liens that might be filed against the property or any unpaid subcontractors and suppliers? That's different from retainage. Now, you can have both in Canada, holdback and retainage, and this is something that's negotiated between the general and the owner, but it's just important to understand that holdback is not the same thing as retainage at all. Okay, so it's important to understand that money and cash flow is really the lifeblood of a construction project. It represents leverage by the owner, for example, or any payer over the people down the contractual chain, because the people down the contractual chain have their own bills to pay, and so whoever's got the money has a lot of leverage. Well, prompt payment acts are designed to help make sure that the funds keep flowing. In the United States, they tend to be limited to public construction projects. In Canada, certainly in Ontario under the Construction Act, but it tends to be the case in the other provinces as well, that prompt payment applies to public and private construction contracts. And in addition, there's this kind of novel concept, at least in Canada, compared with the United States, of holdback, which is the amount that the payer has to withhold for the benefit of people down the contractual chain.